She didn't speak when they accused her. That was the first thing everyone noticed. Not fear, not anger, just silence, the kind that settles into a room and makes people uncomfortable, the kind that feels like something is waiting. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above, casting a pale wash over the narrow office in downtown Charleston. The air smelled faintly of paper dust and cold coffee. And across the table, Emily Carter sat still, hands folded in her lap, eyes steady but distant, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. They had been asking her the same questions for nearly 3 hours, voices rising, then softening, then rising again, trying every angle, but she hadn't answered a single one, not even her name, and that was enough for most of them to decide she was guilty. People don't stay quiet unless they have something to hide. That's what Daniel Whitmore said, leaning back in his chair like the room belonged to him, his suit crisp. His smile measured, the kind of man who never seemed rushed, never seemed wrong. He spoke with calm certainty, laying out his version of events like it had already been signed and sealed. A missing sum of money, a misplaced file, a quiet assistant who suddenly couldn't explain herself. It all fit too neatly, too cleanly. And that was what bothered Ethan Cole the most. He stood near the door, arms crossed, marine posture still in his bones, even out of uniform, eyes moving not to Emily, but around the room, mapping it, measuring it, searching for the thing that didn't belong. Beside him, Rex sat silent, a German shepherd with a dark sable coat and eyes that missed nothing. His ears twitched once, then stilled, his gaze locked not on the girl, not on the officers, but on Daniel, and only Daniel. A low breath moved through his chest, not quite a growl, not quite a warning, just enough to be felt more than heard. Ethan noticed that he always did. Rex didn't react, without reason, not in the field, not here, not ever. Emily shifted slightly, then just an inch, her fingers tightening together like she was holding something inside herself, something heavy, something deliberate. Daniel's voice continued, smooth, confident, filling the silence she refused to break, and for a moment it seemed like the room had already decided, like the outcome was just waiting to be written down. But then Rex stood slowly, no bark, no sudden movement, just a change in posture, the kind that makes a trained man stop thinking and start paying attention. And Ethan's eyes narrowed, because in all the noise and all the talking, the only honest thing in that room was a dog who refused to look away and a girl who refused to speak. And somewhere between those two silences, the truth was waiting. The room did not change, but the air inside it did. Something shifted, something quiet and invisible, like pressure before a storm. Ethan took one slow step forward, boots soft against the tile, his eyes still on Rex, because the dog had not moved, his gaze had not wavered, not even once. Daniel noticed it too. Eventually, people like him always notice when attention slips away from them. He paused mid-sentence, a faint crease forming between his brows, as if the world had just failed to follow his script. Is there a problem, he asked, his voice still smooth but thinner, now stretched across something uncertain. Ethan did not answer right away. Instead, he crouched slightly beside Rex, one hand brushing along the dog's shoulder, feeling the tension there, the controlled restraint. Rex was not trained to react without cause, and that meant something here was wrong in a way words had not yet reached. Emily remained still across the table, but her breathing had changed, slower, deeper, like someone bracing, not breaking. Waiting, Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm, almost quiet, but it carried through the room. Daniel, you said the file was last accessed at 8:30 this morning, correct? Daniel nodded, quickly, too quickly. Yes, that is correct. It is all in the system logs. You can verify it anytime. Ethan tilted his head, just slightly. Then why does my dog think you have not been near that desk since yesterday? The question did not sound like an accusation. It sounded like curiosity, and that made it heavier. Daniel let out a short laugh, shaking his head. I am not sure how your dog would know anything about that. Ethan did not smile. Rex stood, then not abruptly, but with purpose, stepping past Ethan toward the desk, each movement measured, deliberate. His nose lowered, then lifted again, tracing something unseen. The room grew quieter. Even the hum of the lights seemed to fade as Rex circled once, then stopped at the edge of the desk, his body still, his focus absolute. Emily's eyes followed him for the first time since Ethan had entered, not wide, not surprised, just aware, like she had been waiting for this exact moment. Daniel shifted in his chair, the confidence in his posture tightening into something rigid. I think this has gone far enough, he said, standing slightly. I have answered every question. Ethan rose slowly beside Rex, his presence steady, grounding. Then answer one more, he said gently. Why does he not believe you? Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. Something flickered there, not fear, not yet, but the first crack in certainty. And in that silence, Emily's fingers loosened just a fraction, her shoulders lowering, as if a weight had begun to lift, not because she was saved, but because something else had finally begun to speak for her. And it was something no one in that room could control. Rex did not bark. He did not need to. His stillness was louder than anything in the room. His nose hovered just inches from the edge of the desk. Then slowly, deliberately, he shifted to the right, tracing a line invisible to everyone else, until he stopped again, this time, beside a narrow seam in the wood, something most people would never notice, something designed not to be seen. Ethan followed his movement closely, his instincts tightening the same way they had in places far more dangerous than this quiet office. He had learned long ago that truth rarely announced itself. It hid in details and patterns and the things that did not quite fit. Daniel took a step back, almost imperceptible, but enough. Ethan caught it, the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his breath shortened just slightly, like a man who suddenly realized the ground beneath him was not as solid as he believed. That is enough, Daniel said again, but the authority in his voice had thinned like paper worn too many times. Ethan did not look at him, not yet. Instead, he knelt beside Rex, his fingers brushing lightly along the edge of the desk until they found it a small latch recessed into the wood, nearly flush with the surface, easy to miss unless you knew where to look or unless something guided you to it. Rex's ears flicked once, as if confirming what Ethan already felt. The room held its breath. One of the officers shifted behind them, uncertain, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch. Emily's gaze was no longer distant now. It was anchored, fixed on that single point, as if everything she had carried in silence had led here. Ethan glanced up, finally meeting Daniel's eyes, not accusing, not aggressive, just steady. You said everything was accounted for, Ethan said quietly. Daniel did not answer right away. His jaw tightened, the mask slipping just enough for something real to show through, something human, something flawed. It is accounted for, he replied, but the words lacked weight. They fell flat against the tension in the room. Ethan nodded once, then, without haste, he pressed the latch. A soft click echoed louder than it should have, and a narrow panel shifted open, revealing a hidden compartment. Shallow but deliberate. Inside rested a slim drive no larger than a thumb, still and silent, but suddenly heavier than anything else in that room. No one moved for a second, not even Daniel, whose expression had gone perfectly still, as if he had stepped outside of himself and forgotten how to return. Ethan reached in, slowly lifting the drive between his fingers, careful, controlled, as though it might disappear if handled too quickly. Rex relaxed, then just slightly, his body easing, the tension releasing as if his work there was done. And across the table, Emily exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours, her shoulders lowering, her hands no longer clenched, not because she had been saved, but because the truth had finally found a way to stand on its own. And for the first time since the questions began, she lifted her eyes, not in defense, not in fear, but in quiet certainty, as if to say she had never needed to speak, because the truth had been speaking all along. They just had not been ready to hear it. No one spoke after that, not immediately, because sometimes truth does not arrive like a storm. It arrives like a shift, so subtle you only realize it once everything has already changed. Ethan held the small drive between his fingers, feeling its weight, not physical, but something else, something final. Across from him, Daniel Whitmore no longer leaned back in confidence. He stood still, shoulders squared, but no longer relaxed, his eyes fixed on that tiny object, as if it carried more than data, as if it carried consequence. The officers exchanged glances, one of them stepping forward cautiously. Sir, we should log that as evidence. His voice careful, measured, like he did not want to disturb whatever had just surfaced. Ethan nodded once, but did not hand it over yet. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Emily, and for the first time since he entered the room, he truly looked at her, not as a suspect, not as a problem, but as someone who had endured something quietly for longer than most people could understand. Her posture had changed, not dramatically, not enough for someone careless to notice, but enough for someone paying attention. Her shoulders no longer carried the same weight, her breathing steadier, her eyes clearer, like a window that had finally been opened after days of still air. You knew it was there, Ethan said softly, not a question. Emily met his eyes, and this time she did not look away. There was no fear in her expression, no desperation, just a calm that felt earned. I knew it would have to be, she replied, her voice quiet and used, but steady, each word placed carefully, like someone who understood the cost of speaking too soon. Daniel exhaled sharply, a sound closer to frustration now. Then control, this proves nothing, he said quickly, stepping forward a fraction too fast. That could be anything, planted, misunderstood, taken out of context. Ethan finally turned to him, now fully his expression unchanged, but something in his presence had shifted the way it does when a man has seen enough to recognize the end of a story before it is told. Then we will let it speak for itself, Ethan answered, simply. No accusation, no raised voice. Just certainty, and that certainty landed heavier than any argument. Rex sat down beside him, calm again, his work complete, his gaze no longer fixed on Daniel, but resting somewhere neutral, as if the tension he had carried was no longer needed. One of the officers reached for the drive this time, and Ethan let it go without resistance because the moment did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to what came next. Daniel's composure flickered once more, not breaking, but thinning like glass under pressure, and in that quiet space, Emily lowered her eyes briefly, then lifted them again, not to defend herself, not to explain, but simply to exist without the weight that had been placed on her. And for a moment, no one asked her another question, no one demanded another answer. Because the room had finally learned something simple, something most people forget: the truth does not need to be forced, it only needs to be found. And when it is, it does not shout, it stands and waits for everyone else to catch up. Time did not move the way it usually does after that moment. It stretched thin and quiet, like the world itself was waiting for permission to continue. The officer, who had taken the drive, stepped toward the computer at the far end of the room, his movements careful, deliberate, as if he understood that whatever lived inside that small piece of metal would not just answer questions, it would change them. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow across the walls, the kind of light that makes everything look colder than it really is. Ethan remained where he was, one hand resting lightly on Rex, whose breathing had settled into a calm, steady rhythm. The dog, no longer tense, no longer searching, because whatever he had sensed had already been brought into the open. Emily sat across the table, her posture no longer rigid, her hands resting naturally now, as if they finally belonged to her again. She did not look at Daniel. She did not need to. Daniel, however, could not look away from the screen, his composure held together by something fragile, something practiced, the kind of control built over years, not moments. You are making a mistake, he said quietly, not to anyone in particular, but to the room itself, as if the walls might still take his side. The officer inserted the drive, and for a brief second, nothing happened, just a blank screen, a silent pause that seemed to stretch longer than it should. Then files appeared, rows of them, timestamps, names, fragments of something larger. And suddenly the room felt smaller, not physically, but in the way truth narrows space, leaving less room for denial. The officer clicked one file, then another, his expression shifting not dramatically, but enough Ethan noticed, because men like him learned to read what others tried to hide. Emily watched too, but her gaze was different, not searching, not fearing, just confirming, like someone who already knew what would be found. Daniel stepped forward again, slower, this time his voice lower, almost controlled. That data could be manipulated. You do not understand the full context. Ethan finally spoke again, still calm, still measured. Then help us understand, he said simply, not a challenge, not an invitation, just a statement that left no space for avoidance. The officer paused, then turned slightly toward Ethan. Sir, these logs, they do not match the report. There are access points from a different terminal, and the timestamps, they have been altered, not cleanly, not professionally, more like someone thought no one would look closely. Daniel's jaw tightened, his silence now louder than anything he had said before. Rex lifted his head briefly, not toward Daniel this time, but toward Emily, as if acknowledging something unseen, and Emily closed her eyes for just a second, a breath passing through her, like release, not relief, but something quieter, something steadier, the kind that comes when truth no longer has to fight to be believed. And when she opened them again, she did not look like someone defending herself. She looked like someone who had already endured the worst of being unheard and survived it. And in that stillness, Ethan understood something simple, something that does not come from training or rank or authority. Sometimes the strongest voice in a room is the one that knows exactly when to wait. The silence after the words settled deeper than anything before. It was no longer the kind of silence filled with doubt or accusation. It was the kind that forces people to reconsider what they thought they understood. The officer at the computer continued scrolling slowly, each click revealing more inconsistencies, more fragments that did not align with the story Daniel had told. Numbers shifted, access logs repeated under different names, timestamps bent just enough to pass unnoticed unless someone looked closely enough. And now someone finally had. Daniel stood still, but the stillness no longer carried confidence, it carried calculation, his eyes moving not with control, but with urgency, measuring the room, measuring the people inside it. as if searching for a way to reclaim what had already slipped from his grasp. You are misreading the data, he said. Again, his voice quieter, now controlled but strained. Systems like this, they generate overlaps, false entries. It happens all the time. Ethan did not respond immediately. He stepped closer to the desk, where the screen glowed, faintly reflecting in his eyes. He had seen this before, not the specifics, but the pattern, the slow unraveling of certainty, when truth begins to surface and refuses to be pushed back down. Then explain this, Ethan said gently, pointing to a sequence of entries clustered too tightly, too precisely to be accidental. The officer leaned back, slightly giving space, as if the question itself carried weight. Daniel hesitated, not long enough for someone untrained to notice, but long enough for Ethan. Daniel leaned forward, then scanning the screen quickly. Too many variables, he replied finally, his words faster, now less measured. You cannot isolate context from raw data. That is not how this works. But even as he spoke, his tone no longer held authority. It sounded like someone trying to keep pace with something already moving beyond him. Across the room, Emily watched quietly, her expression unchanged, but her presence different. She was no longer shrinking into the background. She was simply there, steady, undeniable, and for the first time the room adjusted around her. Instead of pressing against her, Rex shifted slightly beside Ethan, not tense, not alert, just present. His ears relaxed, his breathing even, as if whatever needed to be found had already been found, and what remained now was for the people to catch up. The officer clicked another file. Then paused. Sir, you should see this, he said, his voice lower than before, not uncertain, but careful. Ethan stepped closer and read the screen, a log entry tied directly to Daniel's credentials, not just access, but modification, a pattern repeated over several days, each instance subtle, each one designed to blend into the system, but together forming something undeniable. Daniel did not speak this time. He did not need to. His silence, now different from Emily's, his silence was not patient, it was reactive, a pause not chosen, but forced. And in that contrast, something became clear to everyone in the room. Not all silence is the same. Some silence protects truth, and some silence tries to outrun it. Ethan straightened slowly, his gaze steady on Daniel. No anger, no accusation, just a quiet recognition of what had already revealed itself. Then we are not dealing with a mistake, Ethan said calmly. We are dealing with intention. The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled into the room with a finality that shifted everything. And for a brief moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because the truth had already stepped forward, and it was no longer waiting for permission to be seen. No one argued after that, not because they agreed, but because something deeper had taken hold, the kind of understanding that does not need voices to confirm it. The officer at the computer leaned back slightly, his hand resting near the keyboard, as if unsure whether to continue or to stop and let the weight of what had already been revealed settle on its own. Daniel Whitmore exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, the kind a man takes when he realizes control is no longer his, but still tries to appear as if it is. You are drawing conclusions too quickly, he said finally, his voice quieter, now less polished, more human than before. Data can be interpreted in many ways. Ethan stood still for a moment, watching him, not with suspicion, not with hostility, but with a kind of clarity that comes when doubt has already been answered. Then give us another interpretation, Ethan replied, his tone steady, not pressing, not yielding, just present. The room seemed to hold that exchange carefully, like a fragile object that might break if handled too roughly. Daniel opened his mouth, then paused, his gaze shifting briefly toward the screen, then back to Ethan, calculating, searching for something that would restore the balance he once held, but the space for that had narrowed too much. And even he could feel it. Emily remained seated, her posture calm, her eyes no longer shadowed by the weight of accusation, but illuminated by something quieter, something like relief, but deeper than that, something like truth finally being allowed to exist without resistance. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her silence, now no longer questioned, no longer misunderstood, it had transformed from something suspicious into something deliberate, something strong. Rex lifted his head once more, not toward Daniel, not toward the officers, but toward Emily, his amber eyes soft, now no longer searching, no longer alert, just acknowledging. And for a brief second, Emily met his gaze, and there was something exchanged there, something simple and wordless, the kind of understanding that does not belong to logic or evidence, but to something older, something instinctive. The officer at the computer cleared his throat, gently breaking the stillness. Sir, there are multiple entries here tied directly to Mr. Whitmore's credentials, repeated modifications across several days, and the pattern, it is consistent, not accidental. His voice did not rise, it did not accuse, it simply stated, and that made it undeniable. Daniel's shoulders lowered just slightly, not enough for someone careless to notice, but enough for the room to feel the shift, the last fragments of certainty slipping away, not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, like something being set down after being carried too long. Ethan took one step closer, his presence calm, unwavering. "Then we proceed with what we have," he said softly, no triumph, no judgment, just direction, because this was not about winning, it was about seeing clearly, and for the first time since the questions began, the room was no longer divided between belief and doubt. It was aligned around something simple, something that had been there all along, waiting beneath the noise, waiting beneath the assumptions, waiting beneath the silence. And as the officers began to move carefully, deliberately, following the truth where it now led, Emily remained where she was, breathing, steady, eyes clear, not because everything was resolved, but because the hardest part had already passed. The part where no one listened, and in that quiet moment, she understood something that cannot be taught, only lived. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is wait until the world is finally ready to hear what has always been true. The room began to move again, but not in the same way as before. The movements were slower, more deliberate, like each person understood that what they did next mattered more than anything that had come before. The officer at the computer carefully copied the files onto a secured system, his fingers steady but measured, as if even a small mistake could distort something important. Another officer stepped toward Daniel, not aggressively, not forcefully, but with a quiet authority that signaled a shift in roles. "Mr. Whitmore, we are going to need you to remain here while we review this further," his tone respectful but firm, the kind that leaves little room for negotiation. Daniel did not resist, he did not argue. Instead, he adjusted his jacket slightly, a reflex more than a decision, as if trying to restore a sense of normalcy that no longer existed. His eyes moved once more across the room, pausing briefly on Emily, but whatever he might have said, whatever explanation he might have tried to offer, never came, because for the first time there was nothing left that words could fix. Ethan stepped back, slightly giving space, not because he was stepping away from the situation, but because his part in uncovering it had reached its natural end. Rex followed his movement without hesitation, settling beside him once more, calm, grounded, no longer carrying the quiet tension that had defined him earlier. The dog's presence now felt different, not like a warning, but like a witness, something that had seen what others had missed and simply waited for the moment it could no longer be ignored. Emily slowly stood from her chair, the movement small but significant, like someone stepping into a space that had finally been cleared for her. She did not rush, she did not look around for approval, she simply stood and breathed, as if rediscovering something she had almost forgotten was hers, the right to exist without being questioned. One of the officers glanced at her, then quickly looked away. Not out of dismissal, but out of something closer to respect, the kind that comes when understanding arrives too late, but still arrives. Ethan watched her for a moment, then spoke quietly, "You knew this would happen eventually." Emily nodded, once her voice soft but steady. "I did not know when," she said. "I just knew it would have to." The words were simple, but they carried something deeper, something shaped by patience, by endurance, by the long quiet space between being doubted and being seen. Ethan gave a small nod in return, not as approval, not as praise, but as recognition, because he understood that what she had done was not easy, it was not passive, it was not weakness, it was a kind of strength most people never learn. Rex shifted slightly, his tail brushing softly against the floor, a small sound almost lost in the room, but enough to draw Emily's attention. Once more she looked at him, and for the first time a faint expression touched her face. Not quite a smile, but something close, something warm, something human. And in that moment the tension that had filled the room for hours seemed to dissolve, not completely, not instantly, but enough to allow something else to take its place, something quieter, something steadier, something that did not need to be proven, because it was already understood. The truth had not just been found, it had been allowed to stand. And for once no one tried to silence it. Outside the office, the late afternoon light had begun to fade, the soft gold of Charleston slipping into a cooler blue that stretched across the windows and filtered quietly into the room. Time had passed more than anyone realized, yet inside the space it felt suspended, like everything that needed to happen had already happened. and what remained now was simply the unfolding of it. The officers moved with quiet purpose, gathering notes, securing copies of the files, speaking in low tones that carried none of the earlier certainty, only careful attention. Daniel Whitmore stood near the edge of the room. No longer at the center, no longer directing anything. His presence had shifted from authority to something smaller, something contained. He watched the process unfold, but did not interfere, not because he chose not to, but because there was nothing left to control. Ethan remained near the doorway, his posture relaxed, but his awareness unchanged, the kind of stillness that comes from knowing the outcome has already been set into motion. Rex lay beside him, now head resting on his paws, eyes half closed, but not asleep, never fully asleep. The dog's breathing slow, steady, like a quiet rhythm beneath everything else. Emily stepped toward the window, her reflection faint in the glass, blending with the fading light outside. She had not spoken again since her few words earlier, and no one asked her to. The need for answers had shifted away from her entirely, and in that absence, she found something unexpected, not relief, not exactly, but space to stand without being measured, space to breathe without being questioned. She rested her hand lightly against the cool surface of the glass, feeling the difference between what had been and what was becoming behind her. One of the officers approached, Ethan, his voice low. "Respectful, sir, we will be following up on this immediately. There are additional records we need to verify." Ethan nodded, once his gaze moving briefly to the screen, then back to the room itself. "You already have what you need," he said quietly, not as instruction, but as truth. The officer hesitated for a second, then gave a small nod in return, understanding more than the words themselves. Rex lifted his head, slightly watching Emily for a moment. His ears relaxed, his expression calm, and when she turned from the window, she met his gaze again, this time with a softness that had not been there before, not because she was changed, but because the weight that had hidden it was gone. She took a slow breath, then walked back toward the center of the room, not rushing, not hesitant, just present. As she passed Ethan, their eyes met briefly, and there was no need for words, no need for explanation, just a shared understanding of something simple, something that did not need to be spoken. Some battles are not fought with noise, some truths are not forced into the light. They wait, they endure, and when the moment comes, they rise on their own and stand where no one can ignore them anymore. And as the last traces of daylight slipped away beyond the glass, the room settled into a quieter kind of clarity, not the kind that celebrates, not the kind that declares victory, but the kind that remains after everything unnecessary has fallen away, leaving only what was real all along. The first sound that truly broke the stillness was not a voice, but a chair shifting slightly against the floor, a small, ordinary noise that somehow marked the moment. Everything had already changed beyond return. One of the officers stepped closer to Daniel. Again, this time with a quiet finality. "Mr. Whitmore, we will need you to come with us now." His tone was steady, not forceful, not aggressive, but it carried the kind of certainty that does not invite resistance. Daniel looked at him for a moment, then glanced around the room, as if searching for something familiar, something that might anchor him back into the position he once held, but nothing answered. The room no longer moved around him, it had moved past him. He adjusted his sleeve, slowly, a gesture that once carried confidence, now reduced to habit, then gave a slight nod, not in agreement, but an acknowledgement that the moment had shifted beyond his reach. As he began to walk toward the door, his steps were measured, controlled, but lighter somehow, as if the weight he had carried had changed form, no longer hidden, no longer protected, just exposed. Ethan stepped aside, allowing space, not as a gesture of authority, but as a simple act of letting what needed to happen. Rex remained where he was, watching quietly, his eyes following Daniel only briefly before settling again, calm, grounded. The dog no longer held tension, because the truth no longer needed to be found. It had already been brought forward. Emily stood near the center of the room, now no longer at the edge, no longer placed in a position of defense. She watched Daniel pass, but her expression did not harden, it did not soften, it remained steady, untouched by the shift around her, as if what mattered to her had already been resolved long before this moment. And when the door opened and closed behind him, there was no dramatic release, no sudden change in energy, just a quiet settling like dust after movement. The officers returned to their tasks, documenting, securing, speaking in low voices that carried purpose, but no urgency, because urgency had already done its work. Ethan glanced once more at the computer screen, then at Emily. "You did not speak, because you knew they would not hear you," he said softly. Emily looked at him for a moment, then gave a small nod, her voice calm. When it came, I spoke once, she said. They just decided not to listen. The words did not carry bitterness, they carried understanding, the kind that comes from experience, not expectation. Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath that held no tension, only recognition, because he had seen it before, not in rooms like this, but in places where truth had to fight longer than it should. Rex stood, then moving toward Emily. Without hesitation, his steps quiet, his presence steady. He stopped just in front of her, looking up, not searching, not questioning, just there. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second, then reached down, her hand resting gently against the side of his neck. The contact, simple but grounding, and for the first time the faintest hint of a smile touched her face, not because everything was fixed, not because the world had suddenly become fair, but because something essential had been restored, the right to be seen, the right to be believed. And in that quiet moment, as the room returned to its ordinary rhythm, something remained beneath it all, something that would not fade, the understanding that truth does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it waits in silence until the world is finally ready to listen. The room felt different after he left, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, like a space that had finally been stripped of something that did not belong, the kind of clarity that does not announce itself, but settles quietly into every corner. The officers continued their work, voices low, movements precise, no longer searching, but confirming, each action now aligned with something solid, something proven. Ethan remained near the doorway, his posture unchanged, yet his presence softer, no longer the edge of suspicion, but the calm that follows resolution. Rex stood beside Emily, still close enough that she could feel his warmth grounding her in a way nothing else in the room could. The faint hum of the lights returned to notice, the distant sound of traffic beyond the building, the quiet rhythm of a world continuing outside, unaware of what had just shifted inside. Emily's hand rested lightly against Rex's fur, her fingers moving slowly, not out of habit, but out of something deeper, something that felt like gratitude. Without needing a name, she took a breath, steady and full, as if testing the air in a place that no longer pressed against her. Ethan watched her for a moment, then stepped forward just enough to stand beside her, not in front, not behind, but beside, the way you stand with someone, not over them. You waited, he said quietly. Emily nodded, her gaze steady ahead. I had to, she replied. If I spoke too soon, it would not have mattered. Her voice was calm, not defensive, not explaining, just stating something she had learned through experience. Ethan considered that for a second, then gave a small nod, because he understood timing mattered, not just in missions, but in truth as well. Speak too early, and no one here; speak too late, and it changes nothing. But somewhere in between there is a moment when everything aligns, and when it does, even silence can carry weight. Rex shifted slightly, leaning into Emily, just enough to remind her he was there, not as a protector now, but as a presence, something steady, something real. Emily glanced down at him, and this time the smile came more clearly, still small, still quiet, but unmistakable. And in that expression there was no trace of what had been placed on her earlier, no shadow of doubt, no residue of accusation, just herself, unburdened, unguarded. The officers began to wrap up their work, gathering files, securing copies, preparing to move forward with what had been uncovered. One of them paused briefly near Emily, his voice respectful. Miss Carter, we will follow up with you soon, he said, and though the words were formal, the tone carried something more, acknowledgement, perhaps even a quiet apology. Emily nodded once. That was enough. She did not need more than that. Ethan stepped back, then giving her space again, not because distance was required, but because presence no longer needed to be constant. Some moments ask you to stand close, others ask you to step away and trust that what has been restored will hold. Rex remained a second longer before following Ethan, his steps calm, unhurried. The dog did not look back, not because he did not care, but because he did not need to. The connection had already been made, the work already done. Emily stood alone now in the center of the room, but for the first time that day, alone did not mean isolated, it meant free. And as she took another steady breath, she realized something simple, something that had taken time to understand. Silence had never been her weakness, it had been her strength, waiting patiently until the truth no longer needed her voice to be heard. The hallway outside felt quieter than it should have been, the kind of quiet that follows something unseen, yet deeply felt. Ethan stepped out first, the door closing softly behind him with a muted click that seemed to seal the moment. Inside, Rex walked beside him, his gait relaxed, now no longer alert, no longer searching, just present, the way he always was when his purpose had been fulfilled. The evening air drifted faintly through the building, carrying with it the distant scent of salt, and asphalt a reminder that the world beyond these walls had never stopped moving, not for doubt, not for truth, not for anything. Emily followed a few steps behind, slower, not from hesitation, but from awareness, like someone stepping carefully into a space that had changed without warning. She paused briefly near the doorway, her hand resting lightly against the frame as if marking the threshold between what had been and what was now. When she finally stepped through, she did not look back, not because she wanted to forget, but because she no longer needed to carry it with her. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, just once, making sure she was there, not out of concern, but out of quiet acknowledgement. And when their eyes met, there was no tension left between them, no unfinished question, no unspoken doubt, just understanding. Rex slowed slightly, allowing Emily to come alongside him, his shoulder brushing gently against her leg, a simple contact, but enough to ground the moment. She exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, but Ethan noticed, because small changes are what matter most. After something breaks and rebuilds, they walked together down the corridor, the sound of their footsteps steady, unhurried, echoing faintly against the walls as the building settled into the rhythm of evening. Overhead lights flickered on one by one, casting a warmer glow than the cold white of the room they had left behind, and with each step the weight of that room seemed to fade, not erased, not forgotten, but placed where it belonged, no longer pressing forward, no longer demanding to be carried. Emily spoke then, her voice quiet but clearer than before. "I thought I would feel something different," she said. Ethan turned slightly, not interrupting, not leading, just listening. She continued, searching for the right words. "I thought it would feel like relief or victory, but it does not, it just feels quiet." Ethan nodded, once understanding that better than most people. "Quiet is not empty," he said softly. "It means nothing is fighting you anymore." Emily considered that for a moment, then looked ahead. The corridor stretching out in front of them, simple, ordinary, yet somehow new. Rex walked between them now, not guiding, not protecting, just there, his presence steady, as always, a quiet witness to something that did not need to be explained. When they reached the exit, the glass doors reflected them faintly, three figures moving together, not bound by circumstance anymore, but by something quieter, something chosen. The doors opened with a soft mechanical sound, and the evening air met them, fully, cool, and steady. Carrying the distant hum of the city, lights flickered on across the street, cars passed in slow patterns, life continuing without pause. And Emily stepped outside, first her shoulders easing slightly, as if the open air itself had lifted something unseen. She paused there, just for a second, breathing it in, not deeply, not dramatically, just enough to feel it was real. And behind her, Ethan and Rex followed, without urgency, without direction, because for the first time none was needed. The path ahead was no longer something to be proven, it was simply something to walk. The night settled gently over the street, not heavy, not cold, just present, the kind of quiet that does not demand attention, but offers space. Emily stood still for a moment longer, feeling the air move around her, the distant hum of traffic, the faint rhythm of footsteps somewhere far behind her, all of it ordinary, all of it unchanged. And yet something inside her had shifted in a way that made everything feel different, not brighter, not easier, just clearer, like a weight she had carried for too long had finally been set down, without ceremony, without announcement. Ethan paused a few feet away, giving her that space without needing to say it. Rex stood beside him, calm and steady, his amber eyes reflecting the soft glow of streetlights, not searching, not guarding, just watching the world as it was. Emily finally took a step forward, then another, her movements unhurried, not cautious, just natural, as if she was relearning how to walk without resistance, without the quiet pressure that had followed her for days, maybe longer. She glanced once toward Ethan, her expression thoughtful, but at peace. "Thank you," she said softly, the words simple but real. Ethan shook his head slightly, not dismissing, but correcting. "You did that," he replied. "You just waited until it mattered." Emily considered that for a moment, then nodded, not because she needed reassurance, but because she understood something now that could not be taught, only lived. Silence had not been the absence of strength, it had been its preparation. Rex moved, then stepping closer to her, once more, his presence familiar, now not as a signal, not as a warning, but as something steady, something that had chosen to stand where others had hesitated. Emily reached down again, her hand resting against his neck, and this time the smile came easier, not because everything was perfect, but because something essential had been restored, the ability to trust the moment, the ability to stand without needing to prove anything. The city lights flickered softly around them, casting long, quiet shadows across the pavement. Cars passed in the distance, life continuing, as it always does, unaware of the small, unseen moments that change everything. Ethan looked out toward the street, then back at Emily, his voice low, almost reflective. Some truths do not need to be spoken loud, he said, they just need time to be heard. Emily looked ahead, the road stretching out under the glow of streetlights, steady and open, and for the first time, she did not feel the need to explain herself, not to defend, not to justify, just to exist in the space that had always been hers, even when others refused to see it. She took a slow breath, then began to walk forward, not toward anything urgent, not toward anything defined, just forward, because that was enough. Rex followed easily, and Ethan stepped in beside them. Not leading, not guiding, just present, three figures, moving quietly into the night, not as a story that needed to be told, but as one that had already been understood. And in the stillness that followed, there was no need for final words, no need for conclusions, because some endings are not about closure, they are about grace, the quiet kind that arrives when truth no longer needs a voice to stand and be seen.